I am a product manager, but I am from a non-technical background, and that's why I really struggle to make decisions around prioritization. I feel it really hard to work with the engineers on a day-to-day basis, and that's why I have to blindly trust whatever they say. So are you in a similar situation and struggle too often with this? Don't worry, I have some working tips for you that will really help you address this problem. Stay tuned. So I'm going to start off with refinement meetings because that's where you as a PM are going to be involved a lot in the technical discussions. Now in the refinement meeting, some call it backlog, grooming, waiting, whatever it is. So this is the most important piece, and this is where I think the non-technical product managers will face the maximum challenge as compared to the other meetings. So listen to this very carefully. Backlog grooming meeting or a sprint refinement meeting, whatever you're calling it, it's effectively a meeting wherein engineers and product managers, the entire team, they go through each and every user story and they discuss how is this user story going to get built. Like when I say how it's going to get built, it involves technical discussions as well. So this is a meeting wherein both technical and the business discussions are effectively happening. So for example, you have a user story, build a feature, you want to build a registration model wherein a user enters in their username and the password and they are allowed to log in. On that registration model, there are, things like there's a forgot password link. So let's take a look at that. So as an example, you have a user story to build a registration model. So that registration model would be effectively be an epic, and then there would be maybe 5 or 6 or 10 user stories related to that epic. Sample user stories for this epic would be creating a login model, like a UI of it, wherein there is an option for user to punch in their username, password, and there is a login button. Second user story could be an option to have a forgot password link on that. The third user story could be there is a checkbox present on there which is effectively asking users to subscribe to some newsletter, and so on and so forth. So you could have multiple user stories. So as the name suggests, it's a user story. It's a small piece of work which will benefit the end user. So those are the user stories which you will effectively create. I'll do a session later on what is the most ideal user story look like. Over here we are not going to get into the detail of that, but effectively you would create multiple user stories out of a single epic, which is like the high level feature. In our case, it is the registration model. Now take one user story like forgot password functionality. So firstly, before even engineers chime in, you as a product manager, you have to explain what exactly do we want the functionality to look like. So for a forgot password functionality, you have to tell like there should be a link on the UI saying forgot password ? Whatever that copy is. So when a user clicks on that link, they are, there is a new UI that opens which asks them to enter their email address, and there is a button called reset password. And once the user enters the email address and clicks on that reset button, there is a success message shown on the UI saying please check your email. And once a user checks their email, there is a password reset link present over there. So when a user clicks on that password reset link, they basically are able to reset their password or enter a new password. And once they enter their new password, they are given an option to log in. So firstly, a product manager has to explain this applies to each and every user story. How is that user story going to work? How will the user interact with it? What value is the user going to get? What does the experience looks like? So all of these details or functionality is something that the product manager first needs to explain to the engineers. Now after this, the engineers are going to think, all right, now we understand what needs building. They are going to think like, yes, I need a model of registration first, wherein there are options for username, password, and there is a link for forgot password. There is a login button, and probably next to that there is forgot password, whatever. So the UI designers at this stage can probably help on which element on the UI lies where. So let them do that. Don't worry about it so much. So the engineers at this point would think, all right, for forgot password, I need that link present on the UI, and I need another UI model wherein the user will enter the email address and there is a reset password link. That is another thing which I need to implement here. I also need to think about storing these values in the database, right? Because there is an old password and there will be a new password. So I have to think what values I store. I will have to store the dates. I have to store the new password. I have to store when this event was triggered, like when was the reset password event triggered. They also have to think about, since we have to send an email, I have to connect that registration model to the email service provider, so that when a user clicks on that link, the email gets triggered, and from that email there is that reset password link. The user clicks on that and then they are presented with a success message and an option to log in. So you see, the engineers are further dividing that user story into multiple things on what exactly are they going to implement here, right? So the product manager has explained what the end-to-end functionality will look like. The engineers have thought about how am I going to build all these things, whatever the PM just said. Now, if you are from a non-tech background and you don't understand how the engineers are dividing, three things are going to happen. These are the three things which I would recommend you doing. First one is notice how the engineers are thinking about it, or how they are dividing because from a user perspective, it's just a forgot password, like, what's the great deal? But you have to see how engineers are dividing that into smaller chunks. Like, there is a UI element, there is a DB element, there is an email element. So you have to see how the engineering team operates. So you have to learn from that. You don't necessarily need to know how they are going to develop. And the reason I say is you have to understand how it's done, because each engineering team, I've worked with multiple engineering teams, every engineering team works differently. So a method that applies to one engineering team might not be the same for others. Like, some engineering team don't want to create separate tasks for users and DB, they want to club it together or whatever. But whatever the approach there is, so you as a product manager, you have to think which team you are in, which engineers you are working on, and just understand their thought process on how they are dividing that user functionality into the smaller chunks of technical work. Now, in addition to understanding how they are dividing it, you also have to understand how they are story pointing the work. So for that user story, what points are they giving? Like, for a UI work, is it like maybe like a forgot password as a user story altogether? They've said it's like a 8 pointer or a 13 pointer, just as an example. I don't think it's going to be that huge, but just as an example. And then you realize, all right, this is quite huge points, let's just split it, and then they create multiple, either they create subtasks or they create multiple user stories. Again, it depends on how the team operates. But the point here is you've got to understand how they are dividing that work and how they are pointing it. Like, is UI, story point, building that UI model, are they considering it's like a 3-pointer, or is the connection with the email, are they giving it a 2-pointer because it's a third-party service and we have to figure out a lot of things? And then what about database? Is the database already built, or they are building it from scratch? So you have to see how they are pointing the user stories. So I'm not going to go in the depth of story pointing and the relativity, because some teams use story points which equate to the time. Like, if it's a story point as 5, they say it's going to take 5 days, some say it's going to take 5 hours, whatever. So some don't even relate it to time at all, which is what I also do in my teams, and which is what I would recommend also, that not relating it to the time but to the complexity. But whatever, I'm not going to discuss that in detail. But for you as a non-technical product manager, it's important to understand how they are dividing the work and how they are estimating each of these work. So initially, you are definitely going to go with whatever the engineers are saying, right? So you have to trust. There has to be that trust in the beginning, because you're learning and you don't know whether a UI story is a 1-pointer or a 5-pointer, or you don't even know whether a UI story should be created separately. So at least for a few weeks, 1 or 2 months at the max. I think 1 month is a good time frame, because you have 20 working days in 1 month roughly. So you're working with them on a day-to-day basis. So 1 month or 2 months, obviously it depends on your learning pace and all that. But after a certain point of time, you will be able to identify, oh, alright, this is how they are thinking about splitting a story. Last time they provided 5 points to a user, to a UI model building. This time, why are they providing 8? So that's when you actually ask questions. last time when we did this exercise, you gave it 5 points. Why is this an 8 now? So this is not about you accusing them of something. This is about you learning and understanding. Like, they might come back and say, that story didn't have this, and this story has these additional features which we have to build. All right, so that you basically, built on top of your knowledge base. So that's how you need to keep noticing and learning as and when you grow. Now the second thing which you'll have to do after you are constantly noticing is you have to ask a lot of questions. What I mean by that is, even though you're a product manager, you just don't know coding, but you know everything else. So you have to think about all the edge case scenarios. When you are in a refinement meeting, when you have that epic and when you have that user story, you are discussing this is what needs doing. Developers are saying, all right, we'll create all these subtasks and we'll point it whatever they want to point it. Now the discussions which you need to have, or the questions which you need to ask at this point, which will also build trust within the team. Some of the sample questions in the same example could be, what if the user does not receive the forward password link? Like, what if there is a problem with the connection in the email service provider? What do we do in those cases? So then engineers are going to think, oh yes, we have to think about this as well, which we didn't consider in our estimates. Or you could also say, how long do we want to keep that reset link active? Like, is there any technical limitation? Can I keep it active for 5 days, or no, can I just keep it for 1 hour or whatever? So you have to have that discussion. Or you could also think about questions like, what if a user enters the new password which doesn't meet the requirements? So engineers are like, yes, then which means we have to add additional validations. We have to show that on UI. What if the user uses a password which they have used previously? So do we want to allow that? So you see, the more questions you ask, better estimates you're going to get for that user story. Because initially engineers only thought, all right, I have to build this model, I have to think about this and that, but then they didn't think about other things which are related to it. So as a product manager, you have to ask all these questions, and it's a discussion. It's not about you not knowing technology or they not knowing about different aspects of this functionality. It's a mutual work. So while they are proficient in coding, you are proficient in business and thinking from the user's perspective, right? So you have to utilize that, ask questions, because now you've asked these 4-5 questions, the estimate for the work is automatically going to increase. So now whenever you are pointing or whenever you're refining a user story next time, you know what to ask and what to consider when you're creating a user story. So that is really going to boost up your confidence and the trust that engineers have in you. No engineer expects you to know coding, that is for sure. So, but your work is think like an end user and do not miss anything. So if you do that 100%, I think you're going to be in a very good spot. You don't know coding, that's all right. You're not expected to code anyways. So I think it's going to work wonderfully well if you are learning and if you're asking the right questions. Now the last thing that I want to mention here is the third point, keep learning. I think I've repeated this, but I'm going to reiterate on this, is keep learning. Don't do it for 1 sprint and 2 sprints and like, all right, I don't want to get into it and let engineers do it themselves. So don't do that, because otherwise you're not going to grow as a product manager, and then afterwards you're going to complain, I'm not able to grow as a product manager and I'm not able to work with engineering team. So keep learning definitely and keep growing. More you learn from your mistakes, more better situation you're going to be in the future. So would highly recommend doing these things whenever you are in the sprint refinement meetings or in the grooming meeting. Now this is the biggest chunk. If you get well at this stage, you're going to be doing great. So highly recommend these practices for you. I hope this has provided you the help that you need to get started, to get involved in the technical discussions as a product manager. Do let me know via comments. If there's nothing else, see you all next week. Bye bye.